we go. Should be recording now. Okay. So let me go ahead and put the. Okay, so now does everybody see the screen with the PowerPoint now? Oh, not yet. There it is. Should be now. You see the PowerPoint with the screen with the PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is sort of where we left off. We've been saying that Africa is, for the most part, it's a largely rural region of the world, but it's as many other parts, particularly in the developing world, they are increasingly becoming urbanized. And the main reason is because we are having, it's sort of like a modern thing. It's been happening pretty much in the 20th century and starting to continue to happen in the 21st century. Now we are having people moving from rural to urban, and particularly in developing countries, people move to cities. Now, and so the map that you see on the right, you see basically the growth of urban population. You can see the numbers as populations continue to grow. They're getting, to a certain percent places, for instance, Gabon, which has a really, the circle is really big. That means that like 87% of the population is not urban. And so you can see that cities are becoming increasingly more urban. And so, and the other reason why that is happening, of course, is because it's what is called an urban bias. That is that in most cities, and similar to what we talk about in Latin America with urban primacy, that a lot of stuff happens in the cities. And so when people are beginning to look for jobs and stuff like that, most of the opportunities are going to be in the cities. And again, as resources decline in the rural areas, people move to cities. There are now over 40 cities in Africa which have over 1 million people. I'll list a few of them here: Johannesburg in South Africa, Lagos in Nigeria. Now, these are figures so around 2013 to 2015. So those figures are larger than they were at that time. So Lagos in Nigeria, in fact, Lagos is experiencing exponential growth, extremely large growth of population. Nigeria is the most populated country in all of Africa. And so as a result of that population explosion, we're starting to see just a lot of issues with that. In Kenya, Nairobi is also extremely large, with over 1 million people. So again, these cities are starting to get bigger and bigger. And as one of the biggest issues, of course, is that as these cities grow and as more people come in, most of the cities are not ready to handle this extreme growth in population. So the result is a lot of what they call informal settlements are developing, slums. And like I say, many places they call them different names, but it's not unusual to see what we see in the picture that you see at the bottom down here, where huge numbers of people are living at the edges of the modern cities. In many cases, the center, the capital of cities, you'll see that process. I think what I'm showing you right there is Lagos in Nigeria. So huge slums are usually built around the cities as a result of this huge growth. And so, of course, it brings a lot of problems for some of these places. A few issues, I think one of the case studies that they're giving you here is the case of urban growth in South Africa. Of course, for years it was ruled by what is called apartheid. Many of you probably were very young, and you have always known in your life that apartheid is no longer the case in South Africa. but for, large number of years, basically from the beginning of South Africa, it was segregated along color lines. So blacks and whites cannot, could not live together legally. And so basically there was sections for white, and then sections for for blacks, and there was also sections for what they call colored. Colored was basically anybody who was a mixture of black and white, which I guess was technically illegal. But they also referred to others such as Indian, which was South Asian, India's yeah, from India. So basically, all the African descendants of people called blacks. It was black, colored, and Indian in South Africa. And basically, like say, they were all separated. People, the races could not mix under the system of apartheid that basically segregated races. That yeah, sort of the date somewhere. I think it was in the 90s. I can't remember the date. I don't have it with me. But when basically when apartheid officially ended, Nelson Mandela, who was the leader of the anti-apartheid movement, was thrown in jail for a lot of years. Once he came out, and there was an election, he became the first black president of South Africa. So what happened in terms of the urban patterns that were developed during apartheid, what you can see in 2004, before when apartheid was the rule, it was a very orderly sort of organization of cities. Again, simply what would happen is the blacks will be thrown into townships, they call them, and that's what you see down here. Township, but again, basically black towns where, and many of them were built up around Johannesburg and South Africa, because again, blacks and whites couldn't mix. So Soweto, for instance, was one where huge numbers of blacks were actually living. There was Ulelethu, there was just a bunch of different townships that were set up around Cape Town, around Johannesburg, where most of the businesses were conducted by whites. Blacks were not even allowed to mix. I mean, they would be doing a lot of services, cleaning places, and sort of like they were the laborers, they were the lower class laborers, but could not mix with. But now, what happens when you see in cities, as soon as apartheid was ended, was not that people live together, they can move in different places, the patterns of population change, and many of the neighborhoods in South Africa, when they began to get mixed officially, they became really crowded, largely densely populated. And so you can kind of imagine when apartheid period, the townships were extremely densely populated. In fact, it was really bad. I mean, the conditions were horrible, like many of how a lot of these slums look today. But then eventually, when that opened up, many of the blacks that cannot move freely actually started moving to some of these other neighborhoods. So anyway, so apartheid in of itself had an impact on the industrial, in the urban patterns of South Africa. And that's just one of the few things. I mean, it's just about every other health services, hospitals, everything got impacted when apartheid ended. Had a huge emphasis, a huge impact on urban patterns. So we'll get back to a little bit of some of that stuff related to cities, but talking about a little bit about the settlement. In terms of the cultural coherence, going into the next theme, now there's a couple of things going on here. There has been a lot of lack of coherence, political and cultural coherence, simply because of colonialism and sort of the legacy of slavery as well. Now, with slavery in Africa, people were taken out, particularly of West Africa, and they were forcibly removed and sent over to the world, as slaves. And so that had an influence in West Africa. And of course, the colonial history, in particular after independence, there was a lot of fragmentation. I'm going to show you a video later on that sort of mocks what happened. That the lines after uh, in the late 1890s when apartheid was sort of carved up, and when countries began to become independent later in the 20th century, there was a lot of fragmentations. Countries were literally lines were drawn arbitrarily, and so ethnic groups that have history of hostility to each other were put in the same country. In other cases, within similar provinces or states and so on at the sub-state level. At the same time, there has been a, um, um, despite all the issues, despite all the problems, particularly in terms of development, economic development, there continues to be a sense of resilience and optimism that things will always get better. In terms of some of the languages, of course, it's a multilingual region with about, like I said, about 46 countries or so. Now, the largest language group that were originally found in Africa, of course, were ethnic, but they're all related to the Niger Congo and the Swahili language group from some of the regions. So you can see the families as I listed over here where I'm pointing right now. The colors that you see in the map are according to the language family. Now, again, many of these are tribal, of course, with the exception of the Indo-European, where, of course, these came after the colonial period. Now, here's what happened after independence. You can see all the regional language that were established there, and they don't necessarily reflect the current countries that we have in Africa, and that brought a lot of problems. So why that are happening is that many countries adopted the colonial language of the European country that basically colonialize them. And so as you can see in this map down here, this is what became the official languages. And the official languages, again, you can see the original families on this big map. And at the bottom, you see the languages that became official as a result of, it was basically easy for them to maintain the colonial language that was being used at the time. And again, you can see those countries that were controlled by the English, kept English as their main language, and the British. Those who were Portuguese continue to have Portuguese as their main language. Of course, lots of English, and then some countries that were French became francophone. That basically the language became official. So the colonial languages basically became the lingua francas. Here's another map that shows you the languages that are spoken in each different countries. It's a lingua franca that is used largely as a way to communicate, as a way to conduct businesses. So, this is, I think this is given to people that come to try and do business with Africa to basically explain to them what language is largely spoken in those areas. So, as a result, now most countries, in most countries of Africa, there will be ethnic languages spoken, the regional language spoken as well. In some cases, 2 or 3, like in the case of Nigeria, where there's about 3 different major tribal groups, and they all speak different languages. So, but because it was a British colony, English again is the lingua franca, the language that is spoken the most. Now the exception is down here on the east portion of Africa, where in many of these countries, Swahili is actually the lingua franca. Many of these countries, as Arab traders were coming down from the Middle East, they would travel all the way down. Swahili actually was created as a way. It's a mixture between Bantu, which is one of the languages that is spoken in the area. It's not a family, it's a language that was being spoken, and they got mixed with Arabic. And so basically the mixture of Bantu and Arabic became the lingua franca for traders that were following the Nile, that were going all the way down to West Africa, back and forth. So, so again, those are the largest groups. And currently, again, in most of East Africa, Swahili is the lingua franca, even though a lot of countries are speaking English or other languages as well. So languages, of course, are issues. As language is a way that people express their culture, and it is, it reflects their ethnic identity. So in the case of Africa, it's very complicated because, again, the huge variety of ethnic groups that make up Africa. I think the ones that I just gave you there, that's just some of the largest families, but there's a lot of others. And so then you mix it with the European languages, it gives it a different sort of post-colonial identity. So it's difficult. The sign that you see here that I'm showing is as an example of some of the challenges for instance, in South Africa, that there's actually about 6 different languages that are widely spoken. The official language continues to be English. Again, it's a lot easier the lingua franca, but a lot of people will speak 2, 3, 4 languages. It's not unusual in South Africa. And so it complicates things, but people usually do what they have to do to communicate, and such is the case in South Africa. It's an example of what happens when we have different languages. And in terms of religion, here's the other thing that, and I'm going to explain what's going on here with religion. Just like basically with language. Remember, language, people can speak 3 or 4 different languages. It's not unusual in Africa, for instance, people speak an ethnic language, or will speak a colonial language, that usually be the lingua franca. Sometimes they might speak 2 or 3 different ethnic languages. But people can speak different languages, but religion is different. With religion, you're not going to be Buddhist, Catholic, and animist at the same time. Religion is different. Religion is very private, very individual. So most people are going to stick to one religion. The most common from the tribal perspective are what they call animist religions. Now, animist religions are basically it's kind of a catch-all term that is used to classify local religions, like ethnic religions, in other words. But animist religions are basically based on, and they're all different. Not all of them have the same deities that they revere or the worshiping patterns that they have. None of them have the same thing, and in fact, they're all different. They all have a specific ways that they worship. But what they do have in common is that worship nature, and they believe that everything has a spirit. Everything around them has a spirit. That includes inanimate objects like rock, trees. Everything has a spirit, right? And so again, it's more complicated than that. I'm just giving you the general gist. So, and that is why it's very difficult to say, okay, everybody in Africa has this belief. That is usually not the case. So they focus on, again, worshiping nature in ancestral spirits. My words are not coming out. The religions of Native Americans here in the U.S. or indigenous people in Latin America are very similar. There are certain things that are being revered. You revere the Mother Earth, water, you revere rain, again, as opposed to having a particular saint or something like that that you identify. So it's huge diversity. In fact, in many cases, extremely complex diversity that makes religion in Africa one of the most complex things. Now you throw in the colonial religions that were brought in by the Europeans, and of course it complicates things a lot more. And just to give an example of what I mean by that, let me show you this map. Now, remember that I mentioned right here around the Sahel region, that is an area of a lot of conflict. Now, here's what is happening. So when the countries were carved up based on the colonial power that colonized them, they began to adopt the religion of those colonial powers. Right? But it ultimately, and because most of these European countries brought some sort of Christianity, Protestantism, Catholicism, and so on, and then we have the influences of North Africa, which are largely Muslim, and again, the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa is mostly Christian. We're influenced by Christianity. Now, here's what happens. The distribution of traditional religions in South Africa, I mean in Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa, has greatly diminished. So you can see the percentages in the 1900s. This is right around the time that Africa was being carved up and many countries becoming independent. So you can see that most of Sub-Saharan Africa, the ones in purple, whatever color that is, they were 70 to 100% dominated by folk religions, traditional religions, animist type of religions, right? But when you see by 2010, you can see the percentage shut down drastically. This is again, that the trend continues. The trend is actually even wider now. So what happens is that the northern part of Africa was largely Muslim, and the southern part was starting to become more Christian, right? Again, so you see the numbers declining tremendously. Basically, when the number of folk religions, traditional ethnic religions, began to decline, it was usually taken over by either Christianity or Islam. And again, northern part was Islam, Christianity was in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the reason why I said that this area right here, and I'm going to circle it right there, is very conflicted in terms of religion. A few other reasons. This is the Sahel region. This is also the area that is drying out. There is also a lot of conflict because of lack of food, lack of water, a lot of transhumance, people moving around, following crops, and so on, right? So that is the area that still remains sort of the boundary between Islam and Christianity. The South being Christian, the North being Islamic. Countries that are caught in the middle, like Nigeria and Chad, other places like that, Sudan, are literally, in fact, Sudan, the reason why it became two different countries, it was largely along those religious lines. The North became was largely Islamic, Muslim. The South was largely Christian. And so at some point, the differences were so much that the country got divided up. And so this area remains of a lot of conflict, sort of this battle, this resistance to all traditional ways of worshiping, confluence with the conflict between now Islam. Remember that Islam and Christianity are both universalizing religion, meaning that they are both seeking converts. They have in their tenets, they have a mission, a proselytizing mission. They want to convert people to their religion. And so as Islam tries to penetrate Africa, of course, there's resistance. There's resistance from the regional traditional religions. And of course, there's resistance for people in the South that are trying to become more Christian. And so, again, you can see sort of like how the Sahel region right here is sort of that cushion that still remains between Islam and Christianity. But at the same time, that traditional, that belt that we still have a relatively larger numbers of traditional animistic folk religions is dwindling very quickly. Literally, we get into the point that basically the North is going to be all, north of the equator is going to be largely Islamic, and the South is going to be largely Christian. Now, of course, there's also tension between Christian denominations. This sort of schism between Christianity, between Protestants and Catholic. So it's literally has become a battleground. I'm not diminishing the importance of that religion, but it has really become a battleground for soul, so to speak, where Christian religions are actively seeking converts, when you look at the Vatican, for instance, from Catholic, seeking converts to Catholicism, that's where a lot of the efforts, a lot of missions are heading into Africa to seek converts to the religion. So again, complicated when it comes to the folk religion, the traditional religions, but it makes it even more complicated with the remnants of the Christian versus Islamic traditions that are trying to make inroads into Sub-Sahara Africa. Right? Again, any questions, you guys can post them up there in the chat or just unmute yourselves and you can ask questions. So here's you can see some of the earliest settlements of Christians. Well, now here's the deal that much of these European religions, Christianity, and largely Christianity, was brought in by colonizers, but there had been, particularly in the northern part of Africa, had been efforts by Christians to settle in, to get in. Coptic Christians, for instance, is one of those examples. These are we find a lot of Coptic Christians in Egypt, and very recently there was, in all this, some of these battles that we have nowadays with, in some cases, misinformation or blowing up and blowing things out of proportion. Recently there was some attacks in Egypt of some Coptic Christians, and all of a sudden we had, and again, no, I'm not meaning any respect to anybody. I know people have a specific religion, but a lot of the evangelical community here in the United States rose up in arms, they're killing Christians, and so this whole battle between all those, again, quote unquote here, and viewing Islam as sort of like this terrorists and fundamentalists and so on. But some of these Coptic Christians are some of the most ancient Christian groups that have been in Africa, around 300 after Christ, very, very early, even way before the Europeans started to settle into Africa. But again, like I mentioned earlier, the most current one, starting out from the colonial period, as kind of the same thing happened in the Americas, you start having colonizers coming in, initially seeking new trade routes and so on, usually with conquerors, with usually the mix of guns and missionaries usually come together. So as these European settlers were coming in, looking for new markets and so on, they're also bringing in the religion. Same way it happened in other parts as they brought in, and they brought the religions to Africa. And again, that continues by today. Again, you can see, like what I was talking about earlier, that North African traders were moving in from the Middle East, and so that's slowly Islam began to move into Africa. So again, right now, most of the countries in the northern part of Africa, of course, we focus in Sub-Sahara Africa, but when you get to the Middle East, you're going to see basically all of the North African countries, all the border of the Mediterranean, they're all Islamic, and the move continues down. But again, with the Sahel being that sort of the cushion between all the countries at the bottom and past south of the equator, are largely Christian, and increasingly so today. And just like I was talking about, the same way that Christianity was brought into Africa by traders and then followed by missionaries. Same way in Africa, a lot of these traders that were coming in from the Middle East, moving things down towards Africa, they will also bring Islamic religion with them. So here's an example, like I mentioned to you, religion, things like that always brings conflict. People see the world differently. And the Sahel region is one of the reasons why it's so conflicted. I mentioned that the conflict in Sudan, where a new nation was created in 2011, largely, usually starts out with some cultural things like religion, but of course it's also eventually translates into economics. The northern part of Sudan, actually the boundary for oil, there's some newfound oil that was found in Sudan was actually right around the borderline between the two countries. So in addition to religious differences, north being Islamic and south being Christian, there was also a fight, fighting for resources. So if you were a Christian in the northern part of Sudan, you were persecuted by Muslims. But if you're a Muslim, similar if you're a Muslim in the southern part of South Africa of Sudan, you were persecuted by, and as a result, there was a lot of violence. Thousands of people got killed, and eventually they say their conflict was so wide that their country had to separate. You created South Sudan was a new nation. South Sudan is largely Christian. Sudan is Muslim. And they sort of find some way to sort of share the oil that is sort of around the border within the country. But even just this year, there has been conflict. Um, um, there continues to be conflict between two. There's still populations of Muslims living in southern part and they're being persecuted and so on. We have issues like that in Nigeria. Now, the other thing that that was mentioning, and when I show you that sort of the area where there's still a lot of hole to traditional religions, and with the advent of new religions, conflict comes up. In many cases, people that are feel threatened by new religions coming in or losing their old traditional ways tend to become militant. And so Boko Haram is one of those examples in Nigeria. This is a very militant fundamentalist group that, again, I mentioned in the first chapter that we're talking about how globalization sometimes groups use sometimes religion as a way to rebel against these changes, these global changes, but usually reflected in culture, like religion, like languages in some cases. And what happens here is, again, nationalism is another one. Countries become, or portions of countries become very militant. And that's the case with Boko Haram. It is considered a fundamentalist Islamic. Now, here's the other thing, that a lot of these very fundamentalist, very sort of militant type of groups, just like everything we see in all sides, they claim to be sort of the keepers of the flame for Islam, for instance, in this case, yet they are doing all kinds of horrible things. And so a lot of people say, okay, Boko Haram is, they're Muslim, they're Islamic, they must be horrible. They must be, all Islam must be like that. Well, they're not. Not everybody's like Boko Haram. Boko Haram has done a lot of extreme, horrible things to young women. They have been basically grabbing them and grabbing and taking them into some of these really small campgrounds, and they've been raped and then again, and there has been there was an outburst for a few years ago. I remember when Michelle Obama was basically women all over the world were saying, hey, these women are being tortured, they're being raped. We need to help them. And so there was a lot of global outrage as to what they were doing to some of these girls. But again, do they mean that all Muslims are like that? No, it means that that particular group, like ISIS, has taken things to the extreme. And again, sometimes when people analyze these movements, they say, well, that's one way that they're rebelling against changes that are happening. Again, you also throw what I talk about, the desperation of the area, the dryness, the lack of crop, the burgeoning population. It makes things even more complicated. So again, now, so as the same way that we talk about Latin America, where we have Islam and Christianity moving into Africa, it's spreading. At the same time, we're also beginning to get all kinds of syncretic religion. Now, this is a lot newer than the independent movements in Latin America. And many of these nations are relatively new. But as a result of that, you're starting to see so a lot of these syncretic religions that emerge. And I don't even have a lot of examples to give you, but because they're relatively newer, but they're also happening. Of course, in Africa, we had sort of the opposite of what happened in the Americas in terms of the slave trade. Africans were actually being forcibly taken out, largely from this portion, this area of West Africa, where huge numbers you can see in terms of the numbers. You can see the millions, talking somewhere around 4 million Africans that were taken out and sent slavery over to Brazil. You can see the big number that were sent to the Caribbean and to the southern part of the United States. But they were sent to other places as well. There was a few other slave routes that they're not as well understood or created. In fact, there's I've been reading some report that there are some evidence of some of these, particularly in these areas that are not as well known in the east portion of Africa, that are still going on, where sort of modern forms of slavery that are taken, particularly for people to work in other fields, to work in other areas. So again, so there's the opposite movement of the African trade. Africans were being taken out in the numbers that you see, and of course, creating a diaspora of African people around the world. Right. Now, what happened is then after independence, and we'll briefly talk about that later on, many of these Africans that were sent to say Europe and all that, and many colonies, for instance, a lot of the French colonies, were a little, look at the people that get colonized is a little different. They treat them a little differently. Many of the former French colonies, the same way that happened in the Americas, not that many, but the few French colonies, in many cases, will give Africans who were former people of the colony there, they will give them citizenship status in France. And so you can see that there's a remnants of that in Europe, and we'll talk about that later when we talk about Europe as well. So in terms of the spread of the African culture, this diaspora that I was telling about, and so the modern days, much of the culture has also been globalized. The song that I put at the beginning, Yosundur, is from Senegal, popular particularly in the Francophone, because he sings in French. So it's a lot of culture, a lot of musicians into in what they call the in another, well, you know, sort of like in the Sahara region, around the Sahel region, Bedouins, nomads. In fact, there's a huge festival. My bucket list to sort of attend one of these festivals in the desert, where they have these big festivals. Sometimes they bring a lot of European, the diaspora, a lot of people that are now real popular in France and in England or all over Europe, all over the world. They come here, and then they also have like Sting. One year was in that festival. Of course, a few other things in sports, for instance, East Africans like Ethiopia, Nigeria, Kenya are well known for basically they hold just about all the records of marathons. Every time we have marathons in the Olympics, and as well as in World Championships, or just big marathons like the New York Marathon, Boston Marathon, it's always usually going to be either an Ethiopian or a Kenyan, and both the men and the women are going to be the record holders. Anybody seen that marathon that happens here in San Diego? It runs over through Park Boulevard and goes all the way out to the park, you know, to Balboa Park. Anybody seen that going through before?
The Rock and Roll Marathon?
Yeah, I think they call it a marathon, right? It's like a benefit, and there's a few serious people running it, but then there's a bunch of crazy people that just party, you know. And I know because I used to live on Park Boulevard before, and I remember the first time that I saw that, it was, wow, you know, it's a huge crowd, they close all the streets, but it's always remember the very first runners they go through are the serious one, and they usually were Kenyans or Ethiopians. I mean, these guys would just cook, you know, both, of course, you know, it'd be the man first, and then there'd be just maybe 5 or 6 of them, sometimes a dozen of them will go through really ahead of everything else, and then there would be the women, again, a lot of Kenyans, Ethiopians, and then after that, you know, you have different levels of, and then towards the end, the people were just partying, you having, you know, dressed up in tutus and weird stuff. I think it's a fundraiser. Some of you probably know what I'm talking about. It's called, I think it's called the marathon, isn't it? The Rock Marathon or something like that. You know what? You guys know what I'm talking about? You can say it or type it out. Or how many of you have seen that?
Is it the rock and roll marathon?
Yeah, that one. That's the one I'm talking about. The Rock and Roll Marathon. Yeah. Have you seen?
Yeah, I think that one goes through it goes up through I think
Yeah, it goes around all the way
like
to the
North
top.
Park or something.
Or something like an Embarcadero or something like that. It makes a whole loop. You know, it's supposed to be what 26 miles for an actual marathon, right? But I remember because
Yeah, it's really big.
the
I used
ball.
to volunteer at it.
Yeah,
And
yeah. You know, people like I say, I think it's a fundraiser. People, but you see, especially the people at the end, the people that are kind of there for the fun, they usually have some sort of they carry banners, you know, promoting certain different causes that they're donating to, you know. But I remember it was always the Kenyans and then Ethiopian, boom, and they do usually be the one that win it. And some of these guys are running all over the world, just uh, in all the top marathons in the world, and they always dominate. So you have that. Of course, a few more singers. Maybe probably don't know Tikin Jabba came off of Blondie. They're from the Ivory Coast. Again, they're French speaking. They sing reggae, and you see them again all over the world. Uh, Soccer players, football players. Again, some top Africans. Those of you who follow the Premier League in Africa. I mean, in England, you probably know Mane, who plays with Liverpool. And this other guy here, Salah, he's actually technically from North Africa, but so they both play for Liverpool. But there's a bunch of them, and then some of the top stars have been some of these Africans and really top players playing and usually in Britain, but they also play in Spain and Italy, and they become superstars. Hugh Masekela put him out here because he has a global influence. He brought a lot of what they call hi-fi sounds from South Africa to the world. He became real popular as sort of messenger with an activist as well. He passed away a couple months ago. Really, really influential in spreading some of African sounds around the world. So now there's also a lot of sort of the spread of African culture, music, art, and film. In art, famous artists that are you know show their work in some of the top museums in both sculpture as well as painting and so on. A few people in Africa have won the Nobel Prize. He's one of them, Chinua Achebe. If you ever want to read a good book, it might be a good time to do it. I even actually seen it online for free. But I remember when I was in college, my undergrad, uh, I read this book and it really helped me understand Africa. I also took a few classes on African history and politics, but it's a pretty interesting book. It tells you a lot about, and it's sort of it's a novel. It's fictitious, but it's of course a lot of novel based on reality of what happened when colonialism came into Africa and sort of the struggle to maintain traditions in modern Africa. A really nice read. But in more modern terms, we have a whole impact of what is called Nollywood. Just kind of when we talk about South Asia with Indian culture, in fact, next of course we have Hollywood, of course, but next to Bollywood, which is an export for films for the diaspora, Indian diaspora from India, Nollywood is has a similar impact for the African diaspora around the world. So the films actually from Nigeria, where this is huge, and they have basically some of these movies that are bought by it used to be that people could rent them in video stores or whatever, but nowadays they get them online and but they are extremely popular with the African diaspora. Have anybody seen any of these films before? Have you ever heard anything about any of these films before?
No.
No, I mean, I'm just asking. Some of you might, I know some of you are word travelers and might have encountered. But I'm going to show you a little clip of this one right here. Um, I'm not trying to convert you to watching, but so you can kind of see a little bit of what culturally what is attractive to a lot of people in the diaspora. So imagine you are a European migrant in say the Middle East or in Europe, and even here in the United States, we have larger or more recent African immigrants that are coming in. And these are some of the things that they watch, and just like talking about novelas and in Latin America, this is sort of one of the things that are exporting around the world. But let me show you a little clip of the Royal Blind Prince. This is one of a typical Nollywood type of film. It's going to be very different. I'm telling you, a trailer from one of these Nollywood films, and there's all kinds of drama, all kinds of stuff. I watched a few of them just to get a picture of what they're like. You can find them on YouTube. But of course, a lot of people just buy them. And there's some that are more, they have like listings or some of the top Nollywood films. But very popular with particularly the most recent. It's typical with immigrant communities around the world. The most recent immigrants are still pretty much attached to their country of origin. And then they want to typically are going to be watching our things until they become a lot more westernized and moving into Hollywood film as opposed to Nollywood. All right, this is from most Nollywood is in Nigeria. And that's what they call the Nigerian Hollywood. Anyway, so a few other things about in terms of as basically as we started moving into into sort of colonialism. Now, Africa is anthropologically, there's all kinds of archaeological evidence that is the origins of most humans around the world are actually from Africa. Some of the most ancient, what they sometimes call hominids, which is some of the most ancient forms of humans that we find in the world, have been found in this part of Africa right here. Some of you, if you take an anthropology, you talk about Lucy, there's some of the most ancient forms of humans. At the same time, Africa in way before colonialism, in the early 1,000, 2,000 years ago, had very flourishing empires that mostly, for the most part, are gone. But many of them reflect the different ethnic groups that, again, are fine. The ones that are shown here in this map are some of the most they were the most popular at the time that they were flourishing, and the period of time that they're flourishing, and they're usually reflecting some of the most prominent ethnic groups that we find in Africa. Again, so the connection with a lot of these ethnic groups that make up the original group before colonial period in Africa are descended from those empires. And some were massive. Again, and they were in the ancient times, there was a lot of trade going on between China, between the Middle East. And some of these early migrations are ancient. They've been going on for years. So you can see basically, again, it's not a history class. So if you're more interested in that, you can take a history class, which is very fascinating. You can learn about some of these really ancient empires. There's still, of course, the racial time has basically disappeared, and the evidence of them until the Europeans began to go into Africa. There were more and more findings. A lot of them were mostly interested in Egypt, but as they began to penetrate, I'll talk about that in a minute here in terms of their exploration, they begin to get further in, they begin to discover evidence from others. But you also have to remember that we're talking about some of the earlier explorers, Europeans in the 1900s, had very different views about people. In fact, they were racist. They simply could not believe that there was any civilized people in Africa. They simply that they were just, primitive people. They were, not even, they knew they were human, but they didn't treat them as human. They just thought it's primitive, ancient people have nothing to offer, they're just close to animals. But there was a lot of that racism that basically blinded a lot of people, a lot of these archaeologists that were largely European, were coming in and to actually study some of these cultures in more detail. There's a lot more nowadays. There's some opening in a lot of places, a lot of universities that, there's African archaeologists that are actually exploring and trying to understand some of these ancient empires that were taking place at the time. So this is all before colonialism. Now, as Europeans began to explore, again, explore, the cultures were there already. They were not discovered; they were already there. And as I think, discovering is usually a misnomer. But it was a lot of the efforts in the early 1800s were conducted by the Royal Geographical Society. This picture that you see right here is a picture that I actually took. It's a building in London. I went to a conference there, and it's still there. They're still, it's an active organization but in the early days, they're the ones that began to explore a lot of these Africa. Now, here's what happened. I remember that I talked about earlier, some of the earlier explorers, put some of the pictures up there. We call them Victorian explorers. David Livingstone, Stanley, there's some really big pictures of them out there. Some of them is actually relatively benign that I put out there. Some of them are kind of gross. I didn't want to put them out here, but you can see them in the museum. They have a big museum that has pictures from some of these explorers. Some of them have male Africans sort of almost hanging, or like a trophy, like they would carry a lion or anything like that. Kind of gross to see. Some are exploring, basically naked and showing them the parts. And and they keep all those pictures in there. They happen. It was a different time, very racist. And in some cases, the Royal Geographical Society has been criticized for that. But they're a modern organization. They're intelligent people there. They're conscious people there that study, and they understand that at that period of time, that's what was happening. Now, something was going on at the time that, in fact, we're going to see some of that in the way that Africa was colonized, in that most of the wealth, most of the resources were actually put on the coastal areas of Africa. So as the Europeans were coming in, they were mostly, first of all, they're mostly interested on the port, and they were interested on natural resources they knew that were there. We're always trying to find a way to extract them and then put them on ships and send them over to Europe. But there was a problem called malaria. Many of the Africans, many of the white explorers, the European explorers that were coming in, couldn't get past the coastal region because of malaria. Malaria were, at that time, they didn't have any vaccine, anything that would prevent, kind of like COVID-19 right now. We don't know what can happen if you get it, and there's no cure for it. We barely understand what is happening. That was sort of the case with malaria at the time. They used to call the interior part of Africa, before the discovery of something to prevent malaria, they used to call them the white man's tomb, because Europeans would go in there and they would die. They get bitten by a mosquito, they would have malaria in it, and there was nothing to prevent it until they discovered what is called quinine. This is a disease. You take a vaccine and they have pills and all. It's actually discovered in Peru. That it had some mosquitoes out there that are fighting dengue and all that, and that eventually allowed people to prevent getting malaria. So once that vaccine was discovered, or that a way you can prevent malaria, you started to see more white explorers, more European explorers going into more the Congo, more in the interior parts of Africa. And that, of course, why opened up the exploration. But because remember that in the physical part, I was telling you that there was not a lot of, no navigable rivers. You cannot really go from the coastal region into the center of Africa. you can't do that. It's no rivers that could take you around. They can take you to some local places, but not all the way to the interior. So it was very difficult to develop the interior part of Africa, and most of the sort of development, some of the infrastructure development was usually around the coastal region. And you see that today, the remnants of that are still left today. So as they began to explore, then they began to go again, usually into the coastal regions. They were, fighting basically the diseases, and of course malaria, which is one of them. But there's so much stuff that I was showing you that is still there today. Was worse then because there was no, you couldn't basically start throwing chemicals to kill the mosquitoes or if you say if you had you were a plantation owner, all of a sudden you had a locust infection and you couldn't do anything about it. They would just basically see the crops, the sugar cane or the tobacco they were growing in the area to just literally go lose it. And so as people, the Europeans began to get to Europe, find ways to battle some of the diseases, they began to basically, how would I put it without sounding, they basically began to partition Africa. They began to spread among themselves. So so this is all happened. So around 1880, in 1884, there was a conference called the Berlin Conference. In that conference, basically the European powers partitioned Africa. They said, okay, these parts right here are going to be for the French. These parts right here are going to be for the British. They're the ones that have been going on in the law. And so on. They literally partitioned Africa, right? But, and so just basically decided in 1884, here's everybody gets a little piece of Africa. France and Britain got most of it, some of the earliest explorers, and as a result, they ended up with most of partition Africa. Now, it's a little bit different in South Africa. I'll explain in a second here, but that didn't last very long. In fact, the colonial period in Africa was relatively short-lived. We'll see the very similar thing in the Middle East. But as opposed to say in the Americas, where the Europeans were there for 400 years, here it wasn't that long. In fact, by 1913, some countries began to get independent. The Europeans at some point began to lose interest, or again, for some reasons I talk about, it was very difficult to still go into the interior part. And at some point they say, okay, we're out of here, and we're gonna make them independent. And I'll explain how that partition works as well. Now in South Africa was a little different in that there was actually the Zulus there. There's some of the indigenous groups from there were basically they challenged basically the rule of the British. The British came in first, and then followed by the Dutch. Now, at some point there was literally there were wars between the British and the Zulus that they would not let them stay there. And so at some point the British were taken out, but the Dutch had actually began to establish themselves. And one of the ways they did that is because the Dutch were actually farmers. Now they call Afrikaneers, Afrikaans, and they became actual, there were generations of former Dutch colonial that began to actually be born in Africa, and they sort of actually developed their own culture. And so once the British were pushed out by the Zulu, then the Dutch sort of took over. But even then, at some point, they had no allegiance towards the Dutch. They were simply just their own, they were Afrikaans, they were Africans, European Africans born in Africa. And they sort of built their own culture. That led all the way to basically until the 1990s or so when they were responsible for apartheid. They basically took over Africa. They created apartheid. They took a hold of it, and so it's the descendants of all these Afrikaans that engaged with the whole apartheid system. But they're still there. There's actually they speak their own language. It's very different from Dutch. and African is one of the multiple languages that are spoken in Africa today. So again, around 1913, literally after World War One, basically most of the European countries said, you know, we're just too broke. We cannot take a whole of these countries. We're just going to let them go, and they did. And so by 1913, actually after World War II, countries began to become decolonized. And so around after World War One, many countries slowly began to decolonize, and basically by 1957, by the mid 1960s, most countries in Africa were independent. They were no longer associated with the country. Now, I know Arturo, you're asking about new imperialism. In fact, in many cases, they call some of the relationships that remain, kind of like it happened also in Latin America, the relationship that remain with the former European countries, in some cases, is called it's a form of new colonialism. Because in many cases, many of these countries were still dependent economically. To say, if you're a former French colony, many of your resources, of your wealth, still was heavily tied into to France. Many of these new countries, as a matter of fact, were actually still using the currency from France or England or so on. And again, by the 1960s, all these countries were now independent. And so with that came a whole other series of problems. What you refer to as new imperialism, in some ways, is what started to happen. These countries became really desperate. They would start borrowing money from, say, Africa, from France, or say from Britain, and they began to get indebted. And so as they become indebted to these countries, then the dependency of many of these African countries was still tied into the former colonies. So as they became independent, remember that in South Africa was a little bit different, because the Africans basically built their own culture. They were white, and they basically established the apartheid system to keep the separation of the races until that ended. So while they were technically, South Africa was technically independent, it was basically ruled by Europeans, or people of European dependency, even though the Afrikaans didn't consider themselves Europeans. They had African blood, they were white, and they were maintaining a system that promoted white European dominance, but yet they consider themselves Afrikaans. Again, that ended with apartheid. When the apartheid ended, tell you exactly the date. I think I have it here. Ended. What year was it? 1994. So in 1994, the official. So in 1990, there was a lot of battle. For years, there have been guerrilla efforts in South Africa to end the system of apartheid. Nelson Mandela was actually in prison for 27 years. In the 90s, after the system was being challenged, as it happens often, as the world began to become aware of what was going on, business began to end their economic ties with South Africa. Banks began to separate themselves. White South Africans began to feel the pressure, and eventually led to the end of apartheid. 1994, Nelson Mandela was elected president, the first Black leader in the history of South Africa. So as countries began to become independent, they slowly began to come together. They created I believe it was right after some of the first movements of independence, 1963, the Organization of African Unity was created. They changed the name in 2002. Now it's called the African Union. And so it's still basically periodically all the African countries come together. They argue and all that, but at some point they try to put together a face. And just like any other family, there's always going to be differences of opinion and different ways they look at the world. But some of the first efforts to try to bring all the European, all of the African countries together. Again, remember there's 54 of them. Now, so here's what happens. When these things happen, when these new countries were created, remember they did not respect the different tribes that were already there, the different ethnic groups, the huge diversity that we had in Africa. And I'm going to show you a little, right before we close today, show you sort of satirical depiction of what actually happened. And so what ended up happening is that out of tribalism began to happen. Ethnic groups basically battling each other. They refer to that as the tyranny of the map. The fact that all these ethnic groups were thrown together into a particular country with regards to historical anything, rivalries that had resulted from that, it really immediately, as soon as independence happened, we began to create lots of conflict. So some of the initial things, okay, the tribalism, the conflicts, the battles, many of them deadly battles that resulted, some of them as very recently with Tutsis and in Rwanda, they were literally murdering each other. And so many groups, in some cases, kind of like what we saw with South Sudan very recently, that some groups will end up in their own place. They were sort of put in their own place, a tribe, and then they are moving to other places. And so we had a lot of refugees. We have people that were going from one country to another one. That's the definition of a refugee. A refugee is a person who moves from one country to another one, either moving away from persecution or other things that are making it difficult for them to stay in a country. Now, also within countries, we have people that move within countries. Again, in many cases for the same reason, being persecuted by a rival ethnic group or so, like it happened in Rwanda, with Hutus and Tutsis that were fighting each other. And so they became IDPs. And trying to learn some ways that I can write things like it was a board. I can do it, but I have to switch screens. It's kind of a problem. But so we have what is called IDPs. These are called internally displaced people. So internally displaced people. They're also refugees, but these don't cross borders. They don't go to another country. They stay within their own country. But again, they've been persecuted by a different ethnic group. And like say in a lot of these areas over here, there's also religious, some that are Muslim and Christians fighting against each other. And so you can see that when you can see the numbers, you're going to see them in that region that I'll be talking about. And right around the Sahel region right here, we have groups that are being persecuted because they're Muslim, because they're from the wrong ethnicity. Nigeria is divided among 3 different ethnic groups, and again, causing a lot of problems. Now, and then you throw in economic conditions, lack of infrastructure, the place drying out, less water, not enough food to eat. These are also areas where massive famines happen. And again, they're not happening perhaps as often as before, but they still happen. There's cases sometimes that you see 1,000 people basically starving, children, especially women, they're starving to death, and many of them living in some of these refugee camps. Let me see, did I? No, I thought maybe I had it. I have one thing that shows you. Oh, I don't know where it went. I have maybe it'll come up in a different one. Yeah, I think it will come out different later on. Anyway, just the last slide before I start wrapping things up. So along with this political conflict, of course, as these countries begin to grow and to attempt to develop, attempt to modernize economically, so you have all these ethnic conflicts, right? People are battling each other. Now, in between that, there was a lot of interest and continues to be in European countries, and from the world in general. Like the latest one, what I put conflict minerals today, initially started out with conflict diamonds. And in South Africa, parts of Angola, Namibia, there's a lot of mines with some of the largest mines containing diamonds around the world. Right? And so usually what happens if you wanted to go mine those diamonds, there will be ethnic groups that will actually be fighting for control of the mines. And then, so on top of the European powers, they wanted to extract those diamonds as cheaply as possible. And so they would literally utilize some of these warlords, I guess you can call them, or usually very heavily armed groups that were fighting for access to those diamonds. And they began to be known as conflict diamonds. And so in the early, a lot of these interests was happening after the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And as the new discoveries of diamonds happened, people began to become aware that some of these diamonds were basically part of a very bloody and very conflicting trade. And it was until like it was not until in the 1990s or so that as people became aware of these bloody diamonds in a sense, Europeans were taking them out. Basically, there was a place in Belgium, Antwerp, Belgium, where these diamonds got processed and got sold. But they came from children working in some of these mines, people losing limbs, and in most cases, armed groups that were controlling basically the movement of these diamonds. Until later, there was De Beers, which is one of the largest companies that were producing diamonds. So sometime around the 2000 or so, 2000s, that some of these diamonds would be. There was a treaty, a convention that was agreed by the world to say that we will not trade with conflict diamonds. And so diamonds now have to be certified as being free from conflict. They were not being traded by places that have conflict. Some of the movies that I posted, those of you who want to do that project, what is the name of that movie? It's something diamond anyway. I can't remember right now, but it's Leonardo DiCaprio comes in it, and they go through this whole. Again, it's Hollywood, a depiction of it, but it's relatively accurate in sort of the conflicts that were going on, and shows you some really dramatic pictures of what was happening with the extraction of these diamonds and so on. But again, now it's illegal to sell some of these conflict diamonds. Well, it's not illegal. There's some of that going on. However, if you want to buy diamonds and say in a jewelry store or whatever, they have now a label that will say that these are conflict-free diamonds. And so you have that option of, they have a certification process that these diamonds did not come from these areas that are conflict-free. Now, and this is what I'm going to show you before we go. I'm going to show a short little clip, because while we are no longer, the conflicts are no longer around diamonds, like I said, because of these agreements that were done to certify diamond-free, conflict-free diamonds, we now have another set of minerals that are now sought after in Africa, in Western Africa, some of the few places that have them. And those are the ones that have to see with your cell phones. There's I'm gonna show you this little video here that talks about these new sort of modern diamonds that are usually, blood diamonds. Thank you, Arturo. So these new diamonds, again, they're really sought after because they're components for most of the electronic devices that we use. They are extracted from Africa, from some of these, not the same exact places where diamonds were coming from, but we're starting to see a lot of the same process that we saw with diamond, where they're the result of conflicts, groups that are battling for the access to it, and then Europeans buy them, or Chinese in many cases are sending them over to factories to create iPhones and so on. But let me show you that, and then while I do that, I'm going to take roll, and then so this is some of the most recent conflict minerals that we are having to deal with today.
Hey, I'm John Prendergast of the Enough Project. I've been working on conflicts and in conflict zones in Africa for 25 years now. But I've never seen anything like the human devastation in Eastern Congo. Violence there is worse than anywhere else in the world. The deadliest conflict in the world since World War II. highest rates of sexual violence in the entire world. What is the most dangerous place to be a woman or a girl? The direct connection between our consumer appetites and violence in Eastern Congo. It's a result of this, your cell phone. Basically, there are 4 minerals that come from the Congo that are in every one of our electronics products. Gold and what we call the 3 T's, tantalum, tin, and tungsten. Tantalum stores electricity in your phone. If you didn't have tantalum in your phone, tungsten makes your cell phone vibrate. And tin is used as a solder on circuit boards. Congo has a lot of tin. Gold is used to coat the wiring, and it's the highest value metal inside every cell phone and laptop. That's why we call them conflict minerals. So here's how minerals in the Congo get from the mine to your mobile phone. Basically, the armed groups in Eastern Congo act like a mafia. The mines themselves are controlled and taxed by these armed groups, by these militias. And then the smuggling routes, as they're smuggled across the borders, neighboring countries, particularly Uganda and Rwanda, those smuggling points are all controlled by these armed groups. All these places, they're making huge amounts of money by taxing and stealing the resources and smuggling them out of the country illegally. And the tool of choice, the human rights violation of choice of the militias and armed groups in the Congo is rape, in order to intimidate populations and punish populations for supporting other groups. When the minerals are smuggled out of Africa, they head to Asia to smelting companies in Thailand, Malaysia, China, and India to be refined. Here, Congo's minerals get mixed together with other minerals from around the world, making them difficult but not impossible to trace. Finally, the 3 T's in gold are processed into components, and they end up all over the world in the products we know and love. Cell phones, Blackberries, laptops, iPods, video game systems, and digital cameras. That's all the bad news. The good news is, because we have a direct role in fueling the violence, as innocent and inadvertent as it might be, we actually have a role in bringing it to an end. The first thing we need to do is to create a demand, a consumer demand for conflict-free products. We need to get in touch with our cell phone manufacturers and our laptop companies and tell them we want conflict-free products. After 5.5 million deaths in Eastern Congo, when is enough enough? We can all help end the war in the Congo. It's your call.
So now this video is relatively new, but it's somewhat there, I think maybe 4 or 5 years old. But this is happening. In fact, there are new minerals. I'll probably show you that on Thursday. We'll continue with this, talk about succession and movement that are going on. But they're all related to these, basically this extraction of these minerals. There's a few more minerals as the technologies get different. Again, some of these are very rare minerals that many of them are found in Africa. There's actually some that are found in Latin America as well. There's a whole thing going on in actually parts of Venezuela. They have products, I think it's lithium, they have some mines that are needed or they use. They're very sought after to make batteries that hold a lot more, they can last longer without being recharged. And so, as technologies get better, most of these products actually come from some of these places. And so, just like we became aware of what's going on in Africa with diamonds, there's starting to be awareness that these products are, again, being taken out of areas where there's a lot of conflict going on, like what I show you here. And I'll show you the other one. It's a little shorter, but we'll do that. So anyway, let me see, just to make sure. Jacqueline Bennett here, if you're here, you can say something or.
Here.
Yes? No? Bennett? Bennett? Oh, there you are. Yeah, I just saw you. Yeah, let's see who else am I missing here. Bermudez, Luis, you here? Yeah, Jackie, I just saw you. No Bermudez. Those are the only ones that I don't see when I look at the list of people who are here. And Delia, Islas, Io, and Claudio Rufo. Are you here? And Welch, Ryan Welch. Everybody else is here. All right, guys. So, well, have a nice weekend. Stay safe. I know this is unfortunately the weather is getting nice, and that's going to be even more when you get out of here, right? So I know it's like it gets nicer, go out and play, but unfortunately we still can't. Anyway, guys. So yeah, take care and be safe and healthy, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Take care. Have a good one, guys and girls. Start the recording. Well, I think I forgot to record again. Oh no, I didn't.